All right. Welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I want to open up with some bad news. Okay. Bad news. I think it is time for us to pack things up because apparently Presup has been refuted. And so that's it. Okay. I was scrolling the comment section in some of my videos and I came across this amazing refutation of presuppositional argumentation and transcendental argument, these sorts of things. As you know, when we do presuppositional apologetics and we argue transcendentally, right, by the impossibility of the contrary, along the lines of, say, we'll say something like, the triune God and his revelation are the necessary preconditions for knowledge, intelligible experience, logic, reason, and all these sorts of things. We'll often be told, right, by the unbeliever, they'll say, I don't need to believe in your God in order to know things, in order to justify various things that I believe. Okay. Or they might say, I could account for the things that you've mentioned, like logic, reason, science. I could account for those things without your God. And so, they will often, well, I wouldn't say often, they don't typically try to do this, but I will be able to provide a precondition of knowledge, truth, logic, reason, science, or whatever without your God. So I don't need your God, we'll be told, to justify or account for science, logic, reason, even existence itself, right? And all those other things, because, there's this argument that apparently that's it. It is a nail in the coffin. Presuppositionalism is done. Transcendental argument is done. And so, this episode basically is basically here to admit that there is no response to what I'm about to share with you. And so this will be my final episode. I'm going to be shutting the YouTube channel down because that's it. There's nothing more to say. So what is this argument? What is what am I talking about? Okay, I'm just kidding. We're going to be here for a while. We ain't going anywhere. So now I often find a lot of responses to the transcendental argument and presuppositional reasoning and these sorts of things. And to be perfectly honest, if I was not a presuppositionalist, but I understood the method, I would rank most critiques of it online, at least, as just bad. They're not even almost like, oh, snap, that was kind of a really good point. No, most of them are pretty terrible. And so, but this one came along and I've heard it a lot. Okay. I've actually had it used on me in past discussions. Okay. But here we go. Here is an attempt by an unbeliever to argue that God is not needed to account for or justify existence. Okay. Much less justify anything else. God's not needed. So what is the line of reasoning here? Okay. Now I've cut and paste the specific points that they made so that I'm reading word for word what they have here. And then we'll see if we could interact with this great objection or counterpoint. All right. So I don't need God to account for or justify existence. And so this person says, point one, existence exists. All right. In other words, there is something rather than nothing. And the second point, he asserts, A equals A. Whatever exists is what is, and not simultaneously what it is not. Point three, consciousness is consciousness of existence. So consciousness, he says, is consciousness of something. A consciousness conscious of nothing is a contradiction in terms. Okay, so I'm going to read all three of those points again slowly so you can follow along. Okay, so point one, existence exists. There's something rather than nothing. A equals A. Whatever exists is what it is and not simultaneously what it is not. Point 3, consciousness is consciousness of existence. Consciousness is consciousness of something. A consciousness conscious of nothing is a contradiction in terms. And so he goes on to say, these axioms are not presuppositions so much as they are statements of fundamental truths. Their power lies in the fact that even attempts to deny them end up performatively affirming them. The axioms themselves, check this out. So the axioms themselves require no proof, presupposition, justification, grounding, etc. This is in part because without them, you couldn't form any of those particular concepts or any other concepts for that matter. Existence is, he says, metaphysically primary and conceptually irreducible. All concept formation is ultimately grounded in existence. And so there you go. No God needed. Okay. I'm going to say that again so you could follow along before we dive in to interact with this, right? These are axioms, not these axioms, are not presuppositions so much as they are statements of fundamental truths. Their power lies in the fact that even attempts to deny them end up performatively affirming them. The axioms themselves require no proof, presupposition, justification, grounding, etc. This is in part because without them, you couldn't form any of those particular concepts or any other concepts in the first place. Existence is metaphysically primary and conceptually irreducible. All concept formation is ultimately grounded in existence. No God needed. So why don't we need God to ground existence or ground anything else? Well, simple, because existence exists, or reality is reality, as we've heard before. Okay. Now, of course, as you'd imagine, there are a whole host of problems here. Of course, I am, for people who are a little slow. Okay. Of course, I don't find this line of reasoning convincing at all. But the reason why I'm addressing it is because this is not the first time that I've heard it. And so I'm trying to respond to things that us presuppositionalists will often hear, and perhaps you're not sure how to respond. So let's take a look. Let's kind of offer some interaction here. Okay, let's start with the statement, existence exists. There's something rather than nothing. Now, I want you to notice something. All right. I want you to notice how ambiguous and abstract this statement is. Okay. Existence is asserted, but no content is given to the nature of existence. Isn't that right? What does it mean to say existence exists? There's something rather than nothing. What is the something? Okay. Now, this, of course, is a metaphysical question. It is a worldview question. If you have listened to my past videos, I have provided a foundation, the three main foundations for every worldview. Doesn't matter which perspective you're coming from. Every worldview is comprised of at least three categories, and these are the three basic categories in philosophy. Metaphysics or ontology, which deals with the nature of being, what is real. Epistemology, which deals with one's theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And ethics, how ought we live our lives? Okay, everyone has these things. These make up a person's worldview. Okay, but notice this person says existence exists. There is something rather than nothing, and we're not told what this something is. Okay, and I want you to notice here that this person is going to remain ambiguous on the nature of existence, and then also, this is important, he's going to make a bunch of metaphysical and epistemological claims without first fleshing out how he knows these things, given his worldview, and the ambiguity of his metaphysical starting point, existence exists. You're going to see this ambiguity throughout, okay? And this is important because when people make epistemological statements or statements of fact or whatever, you have to understand that all of those statements presuppose a particular metaphysical scheme. But what we'll have here, which is often the case, is that they will sneak in. They'll assert something metaphysical, but it's ambiguous and undefined. Okay, and then from that ambiguity, they will build the rest of their case. And of course, we are not going to allow that, as we are in apologetics dealing with a worldview clash. Okay. We don't do this from the Christian perspective. When we say we have a worldview, we have a specific metaphysical. We are making metaphysical claims. We are saying something about God, the nature of God, and his ontology, these sorts of things, and we make claims about how we can know this and these sorts of things. Okay, but I want you to notice that this person is going to remain ambiguous on the nature of existence, and then he's going to make a bunch of metaphysical and epistemological claims without fleshing out how we know these things, how he knows these things in light of his ambiguous metaphysical starting point, namely, existence exists. For instance, he asserts a logical truth. For example, A equals A. This is the law of identity. So those who are unfamiliar with logic, and you have the three basic laws: law of identity, law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle. Okay, law of identity basically is A is A. A is equal to A. So something is what it is. It's not what it's not. Okay. Law of non-contradiction: a statement cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. And the law of excluded middle says that a proposition or a statement is either true or false. So this person is dealing with the law of identity here. He says A equals A. Okay. Now, this is important. He can assert logical truths. And indeed, I don't think I agree with him. You can't even formulate your argument here without doing this, right? But the question is, what are logical truths? Are they material? Are they abstract and immaterial? Okay. I bet he doesn't even want to touch that question with a 10-foot pole, right? Because that will inevitably draw him out of his ambiguity, right? It will draw him out of his ambiguous and empty assertion that existence exists. You see, he wants to put forth these logical principles, but doesn't tell us how he makes sense out of that within his own metaphysical scheme. Okay. He just wants to, this is granted. I'm just going to start with logic, and then I'm going to start using logic and argue against you, but I'm not going to talk about what logic is metaphysically. We're just going to agree that it's self-evident, and then we're just going to use it. See, that's where you need to press. Okay. Because there is this smells and smacks of arbitrariness. Okay. Now, when we ask these questions, what is the nature of logic if he's going to assert logical truth? These are important questions. Because depending on one's metaphysical position, this is going to impact the person's epistemological and ethical positions. Because metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics are intertwined with each other. You cannot speak of one without presupposing the other. Okay? And you see that this person wants to make claims, but he wants to do so without fleshing out his metaphysics. Now, he, of course, just wants us to grant him his ambiguous and ill-defined starting point. But of course, we're not going to want to do that. Okay? Because there are no free passes here. If you think that you don't need God to provide justification, then you're going to have to flesh out the details of your worldview so that you can show us that without God, you can have the things that you say you can have, like accounting for existence, intelligible experience, logic, reason, these sorts of things. Okay. Existence exists, just doesn't cut it. Reality is reality, doesn't cut it. That's too ambiguous. There is no content to that. And the fact that existence is a meaningful concept already presupposes that the fact of existence does not require God to be intelligible. Okay, so that assumes a whole host of metaphysical things that we're going to be talking about in just a bit. So how does this person know the nature of the logical principle of identity? How does he know that this principle universally applies? Okay, he's using it. He's asserting it. A is A, and somehow this has implications as to how he can build the rest of his case so as to point out that God is not needed. Okay, how does he know that this principle universally applies? You see, on the one hand, he says that it's an axiom, and therefore there's no need, as he said, I read it to you twice, there's no need for proof, presupposition, justification, or grounding. But then again, he contradicts himself by then offering a justification for the principle, namely, this is his justification, that you couldn't form any of those particular concepts, or any concepts for that matter, in the first place if you rejected them. Okay. In other words, he asserts that these are axioms, and so, they're axioms, and so they're in no need of justification. But then he provides the justification. Okay. In other words, how does he tell us why these things are they're just a given? They're just self-evident, right? What does he say? He says, because if you don't use them, you can't make sense out of anything. So axioms don't need a justification, but then he provides justification. And how does he provide that justification? Oh yeah, wait, he implicitly provides, wait for it, a transcendental argument, right? Namely, these principles, or the law of identity specifically, are true, or it holds by the impossibility of the contrary. If you don't hold to them, then we lose a foundation for even asserting anything, right? Now, of course, I'm not going to fault him here, because I agree that logical principles prove true by the impossibility of the contrary. They're necessary, wait for it, preconditions. for the meaningfulness of statements and argumentation. They must be the case in order for statements to be meaningful and arguments to be meaningful, since statements, propositions, meaningful statements, arguments, and so forth presuppose the laws of logic. Okay, but it's interesting to see, these are just they're you don't have to presuppose them. They're just givens, and the reason why they're givens, right? I'm not going to provide a justification, but if we reject them, then we can't make sense out of anything. That just is a transcendental argument, which, by the way, is completely, totally okay thing to do. I think that we need to make a distinction, for example, between what we call localized transcendental arguments, like my existence, right? My existence is a necessary precondition for me uttering a sentence, right? In order for me to utter a sentence, I have to exist, right? These are localized transcendentals, you see. But when we're arguing from a presuppositional perspective within apologetics, we're arguing what are the necessary preconditions? What's the ultimate transcendental that provides the preconditions for localized transcendentals like logic, existence, and those sorts of things. Okay, we're arguing at a more foundational level. This person is focusing on logic, saying, I'm going to start here. I don't need to justify it, but I'm going to apply this, and I'm going to press this principle that I don't need to justify. I'm going to press it towards the Christian presuppositional perspective, and there you go. I don't need God. I start with existence. I start with the law of identity, these sorts of things. Okay. And when he said these things, I was kind of confused because he asserted that these axioms, for example, the axiom of existence, consciousness, the law of identity, A equals A, are not so much presuppositions as they are statements about fundamental truths, or elementary starting points. Well, these just are presuppositions. Now, if he makes a distinction between an axiom and a presupposition, for example, an axiom being understood as a statement or a proposition which is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true, then of course, baked into that, right, is the unjustified, unargued philosophical position that there can be brute facts, right? Facts that are simply given and require no interpretation given their self-evident nature. Okay. Now, this, of course, is to go beyond his original ill-defined and ambiguous assertion that existence simply exists. It's to go beyond the ambiguity, right, in order to tell us something quite profound about the nature of reality, namely that there are facts that do not require God as the necessary precondition for their meaningfulness, right? Well, that's a huge philosophical assumption that, according to him, this is a starting point, doesn't need to be justified, right? But of course, this is simply to assert, right, without justification or grounding, that God doesn't exist, or at least the God that we're arguing for, namely the God that exists from our perspective is the one that makes facts meaningful. Without God, no fact can be meaningful. Okay, so he's presupposing without argumentation and justification and grounding that kind of God cannot exist from the beginning. Okay, I mean, if one can simply start with that axiom without justifying it, as he says he doesn't have to, and asserting that it doesn't need justification, then that position, I think, is quite laughable, right? I mean, come on, you, Mr. Christian, cannot begin with God without justifying his existence. That's what we'll be told, right? But then I could begin without God, and I don't need to justify that position. Well, of course, double standard much, right? That's clearly, not going to work, right? And you shouldn't buy it either. All right. Now, I want you to notice also that this individual asserts consciousness, right? He talks about consciousness. Let me read his statement again. He says, consciousness is consciousness of existence. Consciousness is consciousness of something. A consciousness conscious of nothing is a contradiction in terms. Okay. So he kind of asserts, he tries to define for us, for example, consciousness. And this is part of his kind of point to show, like, when you build upon these axioms, or, I can draw conclusions. I don't need God, right? So he goes on to define consciousness as consciousness of existence. Okay. Well, but what is consciousness? See, I want you to pay attention to this. You can't define consciousness and use the term consciousness in the definition itself, right? That's like defining the term love as, love is this. Love is when you love another person. Well, you didn't define love. You just used love in a sentence, right? And of course, if you define love, then you add content. right? And if you define love, or you define consciousness, for example, and you add content to what you think consciousness is, now you're moving away from the ambiguity of existence exists. Once you define consciousness, you're now adding content to that ambiguity. And therefore, you're going to have to justify that, because we're not simply going to grant that consciousness is a meaningful concept independent of God. Now, you might think it's a meaningful concept independent of God, but that's what we're asking about. Can your worldview at the fundamental level provide the context in which something like consciousness can be defined and understood? Okay. All right. So now I want you to notice that. Okay. He asserts consciousness, but avoids telling us what consciousness actually is. He just repeats the word in a sentence, right? Because to do so, it means to add more flesh to his ambiguous starting point. Existence exists, right? So you see, once they start making assertions, what they're doing is sneaking in metaphysical assumptions, whether they are aware of this or not, that they didn't want to lay out at the beginning, clearly at the beginning, lest they be challenged to justify those metaphysical assumptions. And this person thinks, well, they're just axioms. I don't have to, demonstrate them or justify them. But again, as the saying goes, there ain't no free lunch, right? If you think you can have a meaningful worldview without God, then we're not going to allow you shortcuts without establishing your God-denying premises. Okay. All right. I want to know what consciousness is. Okay. What is it? Well, no one could define consciousness. Well, no, if you're going to assert this as a brute given and then use it as the basis for drawing conclusions, relating to the falsity of the God position again, this was a comment from a video that I did, and it was on transcendental argument, presuppositionalism, these sorts of things. You're going to have to justify those things. You don't get to just assert them, right? So this person basically concludes with his summary words. He says that existence is metaphysically primary and conceptually irreducible. And then he says all concept formation is ultimately grounded in existence. And so he says, this is a conclusion, therefore no God is needed. Okay. So there you go. Right. Presup and transcendental argumentation, all of it is refuted, and that's it. We can pack our bags and go home. But of course, we're going to want to point out, not so fast, right? So existence is metaphysically primary. All right. But I don't have to tell you what the nature of existence is. But on the other hand, you go ahead and tell me something about the nature of existence, right? I don't need to tell you the nature of existence, but then he tells us the nature of existence, right? Such that nature or existence rather is such that something like the law of identity is a thing and that it holds. But I don't have to ground or justify this. But I do justify this basically by giving a transcendental argument, which of course you, Mr. Christian, aren't allowed to do, because that would be question begging. You see the problem there. Oh, and there's this thing called consciousness, and I define consciousness while using the term consciousness. And even though to speak of consciousness in any meaningful way requires specific metaphysical assumptions, I don't have to justify or prove them, because they're just axioms, right? They're self-evident. And even though self-evident truths implicitly denies the existence of a God who is necessary for the proper interpretation of facts, it's okay, because I'm allowed to simply assume my axiom, which basically asserts the falsity of your God position, right? So again, this is the level of argumentation that we're going to find, unfortunately, in the comments section of videos on the internet. Right? Let's try. Ready? I'm gonna use the same thing. So God exists. The Bible's true. It's self-evident, and I don't need to prove or justify this, and I don't need to ground it. I don't have to do anything. So there you go. That from my perspective, that's it. My view is true. I picked an axiom. I could build a whole worldview from that axiom, as long as you don't tell me how I know the axiom's true. There you go. Okay. Now, this is very important, because I want to make a distinction, and this is typically done within the context of interactions between, say, Vantilian presuppositionalist and Clarkian presuppositionalist, the presuppositionalists who follow the line of thinking and methodology of Gordon Clark, who was a reformed philosopher. Okay. Now, Clark is known to utilize the notion of axioms, these starting points that you don't prove, but that you choose and build the rest of your worldview by logically deducing things from that starting point. Okay. Now, Vantilian presuppositionalism doesn't start with axioms in that sense. So axioms in that sense are by definition unprovable. Okay. And of course, for Gordon Clark, if you tried to prove your axiom, then that's not your axiom. The things that you appeal to validate and justify your axioms are your genuine axioms. And so axioms are your starting point. Okay. Van Til did not hold to this position because anyone could create any starting point. Doesn't matter if I pick a starting point, it doesn't mean it's true, right? I would argue that that's a form of fideism. We pick an axiom and hold to it fideistically. And I just don't think that that's not what we're doing as presuppositionalists. Okay. We believe that we can have ultimate presuppositional starting points that are justified not by appealing to something more fundamental than that starting point, but by appealing to the transcendental necessity of that starting point, arguing by the impossibility of the contrary. Okay. That is just to say that we believe that you can justify your starting points, but you justify your starting points through transcendental argument or indirect argumentation. Okay. Now, this is true independent of whether you think the transcendental argument is good or it works or whatever. That's how you justify your ultimate presuppositions. Okay. We're not starting as Vantilians. We're not starting with unprovable starting points. That's not the presuppositional position. As a matter of fact, the transcendental argument is called an argument. It's meant to be argued. Okay. So again, anyone who says, well, you're just asserting your position, you just don't understand what transcendental arguments are. And quite frankly, I've explained it in other videos, and I think it's been explained multiple times, but I still hear the same criticisms. If I was not a Christian, I would still, and I knew what a transcendental, I was like, yeah, it's an argument. If I wasn't a Christian, maybe I don't agree with the argument. Maybe I have criticism, the critiques, but to call it not an argument and just a bare authority claim, you just don't know what you're talking about. So anyway, so basically this person who offered this argument or line of reasoning, this person wants basically to take transcendental categories like existence, the laws of logic, consciousness, or self-awareness, and simply have us grant him those as axioms that he doesn't need to justify, prove, or account for. But of course, we as presuppositionalists we're basically asking, how do these transcendental categories even make sense from within their own worldview? If you say you're a naturalist, for example, and then you explain, explain how these categories make sense from a worldview of naturalism or from within whatever worldview you hold. Simply saying that I don't need to justify them, I simply assert them, is to be arbitrary. And that would destroy, of course, argumentation and meaningful interaction. Right. But what happens when they begin to justify, these things, when they offer, we quickly then see that the worldviews that they put forth basically reduce either to arbitrariness or inconsistency or any number of fallacious lines of reasoning. Okay. So we want to be very careful when someone asserts, this is my starting point, and it's this starting point I'm going to stand on to build my case against you, Mr. Christian, or more specifically against the presuppositionalist who is making a transcendental argument. Okay. I'm going to start from this starting point, but I don't need to justify or prove it, but it's that starting point. Then I'm going to build everything else to refute your position. Again, yeah, okay. It reminds me of like the Wizard of Oz, right? Like, don't look behind the curtain, right? Look at how flashy existence exists. Reality is reality. But of course, behind the curtain, there's kind of a scrawny little dude in the back pushing the gears and all these sorts of things, right? You need to ask, because presuppositional apologetics places a great emphasis on worldview conflict, right? We're going to want to get to the foundation of the conflict. We're willing to show you what's behind the curtain, right? Our foundation is the triune God and his revelation, right? We believe that the triune God exists, that he's revealed himself both in general and special revelation. And if you reject the worldview put forth in his revelation, then you have a position that reduces to absurdity. You don't have to agree with that. You don't have to say, hey, that's a good. The point is, we are showing you what the foundation is. But this gentleman over here doesn't tell us the foundation, or at least it doesn't recognize. I'll give him a benefit of the doubt. He doesn't recognize that when asserting the things he asserts, there's someone behind the curtain. He's saying, don't look, right? Existence exists. Reality is reality. A equals A. Consciousness is consciousness of something. So he grabs something, but it's very ambiguous, doesn't have to define it, and then makes a bunch of assertions and uses those assertions to argue against the idea that the God of Christianity is the necessary precondition for the intelligibility of any fact, even the fact of existence itself. Okay. So again, we want to be able to press for the foundation. All right. And we do that by saying, excuse me, when you say existence exists, what do you mean? Well, there's something rather than nothing. Okay, there's something. What is the something? Well, it's just a something. It's an ambiguous something that I can't define, because once I define it, then I have to flesh out my metaphysic, and then I can then be challenged as to why I think reality is the way that I am assuming it is, right? Or I'm axiomatically asserting that it is. Okay. That doesn't work. Okay. That is arbitrary. All right. So we want to be able to identify, okay, when our debate partner is being arbitrary. Okay. And there you go. So again, this I didn't find this at all convincing, but it was there, and I was like, you know what? I've heard this a lot. Maybe I should do a quick response on it. And so hopefully, this is helpful. If anything, what I've said will help you identify when someone sneaks in metaphysical claims. So when you have a metaphysical position, we're not just granting that to you, bro. You need to justify that. Okay. And so we want to point that out. Okay. Don't let you want to master the art of identifying when someone is sneaking certain things in that require justification. And when someone waves their hand and says, oh, well, that's an axiom, I don't need a justification. So what you're going to do then, okay, when someone says that, you're going to wave your hand back and be like, okay, God exists, the Bible's true, I don't need a justification. There you go. That's right. So my axiom can beat up your axiom. There you go. Right. So again, arbitrariness and inconsistency, two intellectual sins that you will see often is the case when people are putting forth their positions, and you need to be able to work hard to identify those things. All right. All right. Well, that's it for this short episode. We're here on 32 minutes. Usually I go longer, but I was just addressing one point here. If you like the content and you find it useful, please be sure to click the like button, share this content as well, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. What's super helpful is if you write a review on iTunes, the podcast. That's super helpful as well, and get the word out. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and until next time, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.